In 1988, the internet was far behind where it stands today. Used mostly by universities for academic purposes and by the government for researchers, the connection methods of the internet are far different than how they work today. But around 8:30 p.m. on November 2nd, 1988, everything will change. A message gets sent from a concerned student at the University of California, Berkeley, on the night of November 2nd. It read, "We are currently under attack. This is the birthplace of computer crime in America." ARPANET was nearing its second decade. The first Motorola mobile phone was just released, and the Silicon Valley was enriched with possibilities. But none of this comes close to the dawn of a new technological era. In 1981, IBM releases its first personal computer, the IBM Personal Computer, or the IBM PC Model 5150. In 1983, January 1st was dedicated as the birthday of TCP/IP, also known as the Internet. Robert Morris was an innovator at Bell Labs, a research and development branch of Nokia. Bell Labs is who we have to thank today for Unix systems. His son, Robert Tappan Morris, was a graduate student at Harvard and a talented computer scientist. Since his father was a computer innovator at Bell Labs, Morris was immersed in technology just as it was taking its first steps into society. Remember how Bell Labs created Unix? That's UNIX, originally derived from Multics, which stood for Multiplexed Information and Computing System, until they changed multiplexed to uniplexed because Unix was much smaller than Multics. Morris, being the son of the man who had helped develop Unix, and just recently getting a degree in mathematics at Harvard, transferred to Cornell to study. During his time studying, this is when he released the first computer crime. The worm relied on three things. Firstly, a bug in the finger service, a Unix operation to look up user information. This is how it spread. Access to so many new victims from one infected computer by the now archaic Contacts computer program. Number 2 was a weak password guessing brute force operation, trying the most common passwords from an automated list. The internet was young, secure passwords were foreign to this youthful internet. And lastly, a flaw in SendMail, one of the widely used emailing applications in the 1980s. It had a feature which was a debug mode, as most applications do. Intended for debugging and troubleshooting, this feature was expertly taken advantage of by Robert Tappan Morris. No passwords for debugging meant commands could be run on your email without administrator access, or any passwords. Once it had a grip on your device, it was far too late. It's not just called a worm because it worms its way into your device. It's invasive, and oftentimes hard to terminate. After it infected your device, it would always run in the background. It would replicate itself to prevent its destruction, and it would continue to rampage the internet through university networks, research labs, and even military systems. So what went wrong? Morris wanted his worm to succeed, even when trying to be stopped. He included just a small snippet of logic into his code. That snippet was that every 7th infection attempt on a device, it would force its way into the device, even if it is already infected. This dangerous line of code made the Morris worm not just spread rapidly, but because it would often run multiple times on one computer, it exponentially grew, slowing the internet as the world knew it to a crawl. The worm had infected roughly 10% of the existing internet, or 6,000 computers. To put this into perspective, Google handles roughly 20 petabytes of data every day. If 10% of that was slowed to a crawl, over 2 million gigabytes of data would be stopped. That's the equivalent of 38,130 high-quality 4K copies of the entirety of Avengers Endgame. And Morris hadn't just affected one company. He crippled the entire existing internet. Damages were roughly estimated to be 100,000 to 10 million, or, adjusted for inflation, 273,000 to $27.3 million. Tracking down the culprit was honestly, while stressful, the easiest part of this case. After some time of investigators scratching their heads trying to figure out the origin of this nasty malware, a friend of Morris's had contacted the New York Times. He confessed that RTM had designed the project as a harmless experiment and that the spread was due to a programming error. Using the initials RTM, the New York Times publicly stated that the culprit was a 23-year-old university graduate student named Robert Tappan Morris. The federal government investigated into this, and this marks the first time that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was used to prosecute Robert Tappan Morris. Section 1030 penalizes the conduct of an individual who, quote, intentionally accesses a federal interest computer without authorization, end quote. Morris's worm had made its way into military computer systems. The court ruled that, regardless of his intentions, Morris had access to systems he had no right to access, violating exceeding authorized access under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Morris was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of $10,000. The Robert Tappan Morris worm was detrimental to the internet. However, it was solved with a patch to the SendMail emailing platform, as well as the Unix finger command. This sudden shock to the internet was the birthplace of CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team. This was also the first national agency created for cybersecurity. This is the birthplace of secure password practices, as well as the public awareness for the potential for a device to be infected. U.S. v. Morris was foundational in defining cybercrime. It was the first major case of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Judges had to decide what that act meant for the internet, defining terms we use nowadays, such as unauthorized access and exceeding authorized access, terms that we're familiar with. Even though Morris had access to these computers, because he bypassed security barriers and exploited vulnerabilities, they used this as a base to define intent to circumvent restrictions. Regardless if it was malicious intent, it defined the action of exceeding your authorization is a crime. The court case still defines cybercrime today. Without this court case, would we be able to prosecute malware developers for theft of data? Would cybersecurity practices be as secure as they are today? The Morris worm took advantage of the internet at a very young time in its lifespan. With today's sheer expanse of the internet, more dangerous things lurk than a simple email script. Many different breeds of malware run rampant along the dark and unobserved corners of the internet. Morris never intended for his email script to break the internet, but his foolishness shed light on the fragility of the internet. Because of his poor choices, the internet has become increasingly secure as lifetime goes on. And the courts can thoroughly prosecute cybercrimes because he was the first person to commit one. Period.